Grief Stories is not a crisis resource. Please seek support from a qualified professional in your area to meet your unique emotional and medical needs. You're listening to the Grief Stories podcast. I'm your host, Maureen Pollard, a social worker with an interest in helping people find hope and healing when someone they love has died. In each episode, you'll hear a conversation with a guest, sharing their story and insights about what can help when you're adapting to loss. At Grief Stories, we're helping grief make sense, one story at a time. Today's guest is Jarie Bolander, author of Ride or Die, Loving Through Tragedy. Welcome to the Grief Stories podcast, Jarie. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, you're quite welcome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So at the Grief Stories podcast, what we do is we invite guests to talk a little bit about their experience of loss, to talk with us about some of the real challenges that come along with grief and loss, and then to talk a little bit about how they're finding hope and healing as you carry that story that you've got now that you've had this experience. So I want to begin by inviting you to tell us a little bit about your story of loss.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for having me on. Excited to chat about my journey, which has been encapsulated in a book, my memoir that came out last week called Ride or Die, Loving Through Tragedy, a Husband's Memoir. And it's the story about my late wife, Jane, who died of leukemia after a 15-month battle. She ended up, she died at 36, right? So pretty tragic in that sense. And you know, for the 15 months that we were battling, or she was battling, I was helping her, obviously, as her caregiver and her husband, and also running her business. It was, you know, I don't know what really prepares you for that, to be honest. It was a trying time, to say the least, but also there was some joy and happiness during that time. I mean, you know, we became extremely close as a couple, as people. I not only, you know, expanded my horizons into caregiving and running her PR business, which I was an engineer by training, but also, you know, it just sort of taught me every day is precious. You know, like seems cliche, but boy, when you don't have many days left, every one of those seems to be important, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, 36 is so young. Right. Yeah, never mind that, you know, you've got a terminal diagnosis and declining health. That's so young to be losing all the things that you're usually at that age in the midst of building. Right.
Yeah. We found out she had leukemia because we were trying to get pregnant and have kids. So, you know, she had a bunch of miscarriages and.
Yeah. And some of the testing then showed in the blood work, that's how the leukemia was found. Yeah. And so you shifted right out of life building into how to hold on maybe, and then facing the loss.
Yeah. Yeah. Went from life building, type A power couple, getting out in the world, crushing it, trying to, you know, have a family, to reeling from how the heck do we deal with this now? You know, you know, when they say life changes in an instant, like it changed in an instant. I just remember, you know, they call us into the emergency room. I'm like, what the heck are we doing here? And then we think you have leukemia. And literally in that instant, now what? Yeah. I have no clue what to do now. So.
Everything that had been on your agenda was thrown up into the air, and you were starting from scratch in this place where nobody wants to be, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. What would you say were some of the biggest challenges then? I think, you know, going through an illness and being a caregiver is, you know, often quite trying. It stretches us into different ways that we weren't expecting. And particularly when we're younger. I mean, sometimes once we hit middle age or older, we kind of expect to be doing some caregiving, you know, but when we're young, it doesn't always cross our radar, doesn't occur to us.
Well, I mean, I think the only kind of caregiving you would even think of is kids, right? Having kids.
Yeah. Yeah.
like, oh, okay, now I got to keep these little humans alive to the
That's
next
right.
level, And then as you
Yeah.
get older, you think, okay, now you got to take care of your parents and all that sort of stuff, which can be a bit of a challenge, obviously.
Yeah.
The struggle on that, especially, as parents age, you then become the parent almost. But yeah, I mean, the idea of being the caregiver for we were newlyweds, right? I mean, little over a year, married little over a year. So the idea that I now have to shift from husband to caregiver, and the shift isn't immediate, but it's a different perspective, right? Like gone are the days of the fancy dinners and going out and crushing the world. And it's replaced by meds, inpatient chemo, doctor's appointments, updates, running a business. I've never even have a clue what I'm supposed to do. And it was literally the only thing paying the bills, right? So, and affording me the flexibility to go to every appointment. I mean, I think I pretty much went to every appointment, if I recall. I mean, her family went to some as well. They were extremely supportive as well. That was one of the, you never want to have to go through this, but you never want to go through this alone. and it's really horrible. So they were pretty fantastic as well. So yeah, it's just different, you never prepare. How can you even prepare for that,
Yeah. And it's, it sets you apart from your peer group. It sets you apart from other family members sometimes too. And you're kind of, it feels to me like you might be kind of lost in this world of meds and schedules and appointments and side effects and, what is she taking in and what's the output and all of those kind of things that the minutia of care. Yeah.
That's true.
Like you kind of get swallowed by it for a time.
Well, I think you get swallowed by it. You lose yourself. I think that's the other thing that I found that was something that didn't happen overnight, and I didn't really realize, but I wasn't me anymore. Like I was Jane's husband. Her name was Jane. I was Jane's husband and I'm her caregiver. And I was captain of Team Jane, for lack of a better word. And you lose a little bit of your humanity in that. And not because your sick spouse obviously, doesn't want that to happen, but by necessity and by just the sheer weight of the situation, people are going to ask how she's doing before they're going to ask how you're doing. It's totally natural. And there are people that did ask how I was doing, over time, but also, from a male perspective, as being the stoic, like my job's to protect my wife. I got this, like that's the kind of guy I was even before this, like crushing it. I was an entrepreneur, like everything's always sunny, rainbows and unicorns in Startup Land. It's not always rainbows and unicorns in Startup Land, by the way. It's not that in life either, right? As you know. Yeah. So you just sit there and you go, wow, like what can you even do about that? Like,
well, it's almost, you've got to rearrange everything because this is not how this was supposed to go.
No.
This was not on the agenda. It was not printed on the fancy paper. And yet, so here you are kind of mid-stride and shifting into this new role in a new way that you're unfamiliar with, unprepared for, and you're knee deep in it very quickly in that experience, right? And I, in reading your memoir, I saw that, right, that there was that from one moment to the next, everything was okay, and then all of a sudden, everything was not okay, right?
Changes in an instant. I mean, again, the cliches are there, but wow, I just never would have thought. You take the marriage vows, right? In sickness and health till death do you part. People say it all the time. I didn't really know what that meant. I now know what that means.
Right.
And that's what the book's about. Literally what it meant to us. That's why it's called Ride or Die. But,
so you kind of rolled it. Yeah, you moved through it. You adjusted, you adapted, you moved through it. You did what was necessary. And, as we know, sometimes all the things we do are still not enough to keep a person with us. And so Jane passed away and and that brings its own challenges. In the time that you're a caregiver, you're wrestling with hope and anticipatory grief, right?
Mm-hmm.
The possibility of grieving is looming over any hope that you have. And then when the death happens, everything shifts again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I mean, it's interesting because there's different like stages of grief and loss, right? The first loss is the loss of a partner. We're not a couple anymore. We're a couple, but we're not a couple. Like the relationship shifts from caregiver, patient, for lack of a better word, or your charge, or however the technical term.
Yeah.
The anticipatory grief, when you sort of realize, and there was a day, probably 5 months before she died, probably, where I said, that was the first time I actually thought to myself, this could end badly.
Yeah.
And that was a whole other level of emotion and anxiety and stress. And then when she died, there was the overwhelming, like, what the hell do I do now? Right? Like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. And yeah, it was just, I guess the kind of the acute stage of it is the weird, never felt that before, but it's like, again, what prepares you for that? I mean, part of the reason I wrote the book was not only to bear witness to Jane and to the struggle, but also not a lot of material, not a lot of resources out there for men that can actually, hey, what's it like as a man, and again, like, it's my experience. I'm just one man, but I didn't find anything where I could like, oh, how am I, not even how I'm supposed to deal with this, just like, what's someone else's experience with this? And that just, well, I found, the things I did find, I found comfort in. And I also found, hey, I don't want to feel so alone. I think that was the thing. You're surrounded by people, but you still feel alone.
Yeah. And I think what you're expressing really about men's experience as caregivers, men's experience as grief, men's experience as emotional beings, right, is often sort of underplayed and not really permitted or embraced in Western society. And so here we are, you're going through this deeply emotional experience, and there's not much out there that says what's normal if you're a man going through this experience, what to expect, and how to find your way through, how to find some comfort and ease as you figure out how to adjust to losing your partner, your life partner, your hopes, your dreams, and often men are, there's an expectation around how men should handle stuff.
Yes.
And that makes it even more difficult for you to just be with what's real for you.
Yeah. Yeah. I always characterize it as women can cry, but not get upset. Men can get upset and not cry. Now, I'm not saying, we're going to go through the whole modality of men and women, and I'm sure there's lots of controversy about, but, again, especially in this day and age where everyone's trying to like figure out their pronoun, and like, there's a lot of thrash around that, right? But I think general disposition, if you just look at the broader sense of communities, of the nation, of just society in general, we just don't do a very good job in the US on dealing with death, full stop, even for men and women, especially for men, especially if you're trying to share a natural human emotion to literally let it out so it doesn't consume you. And I think this is the major problem when it comes to men in grieving. I'm not saying that, every man's got to cry in public. I've done that multiple times. Why would you not get choked up when you're talking about your dead wife? I mean, like, yes, there are times where maybe those emotional things are not a good thing to do. Like someone's trying to kill you. You're like running into a burning building. Yeah, you got to get your stuff together. And as men, we do the danger stuff, right? Like, go off and do this dangerous thing. Well, in a safe environment where you need to express what your body is telling you to express. I mean, it just eats you inside. You feel all the cortisol dump. You feel the tension in your stomach. You feel everything, the failure lump, as I always like to put in the book. These are emotions and these are physical things that have to be let out. And how you let them out for men is generally anger, right? People don't like that. I don't like to be, I mean, of course I would get angry, but the other side of the emotion is just the expression of that, of the pure and utter absolute screwed up nature of what you just experienced. You sometimes just got to let it out through crying, or just really like the sob or the wail or whatever it is. And I just think we're missing that. And you know what? I'm guilty of it too. I grew up as a Gen Xer, grew up in, where you walked it off, right?
Yeah.
You got hit in the nuts, you walked it off.
Yeah. Well, and I think, right. And I think those,
right?
Those are the things that we're teaching boys and girls from a very young age what's acceptable in terms of emotional expression. And at the heart of it, anger is underlaid with pain and fear. So pain and fear are vulnerable feelings.
Yeah.
And we don't like to be vulnerable, and men aren't really encouraged or allowed to be vulnerable most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I know we're talking some stereotypes here, but stereotypes also sort of have this basis in what our experience has been. And so because you're not really welcome to be vulnerable in your pain and fear, anger becomes that kind of go-to response, which then causes its own problems, right? And doesn't resolve the pain and fear.
Right. And to your point about stereotypes or just general, differences between more, agreeable people and more aggressive and or more, dominant people. I mean, the distribution of men and women has overlap. It's got huge overlap. In fact, the predominant male trait that people, the aggressive male is, 10% of the high end of the distribution. And the emotional, crying, wailing woman stereotype is on the other side of that distribution. So there's a lot of overlap. But I think we have to acknowledge that those sort of tropes, those personas, those stereotypes are there. One, they're there, so you have to deal with them. You just can't say, oh, men should just cry. You can't. That just doesn't really solve the problem. It's myopic and it's short-sighted, and it's actually not compassionate at all. Like, you need to meet people where they are. It's the same argument people use for, I am, want you to use this pronoun, or I am this person, or I'm this type of race, whatever it is. Like, you have to meet people where they are, no matter what. That's just compassionate. We miss all that. So if a man doesn't want to share his feelings, that is okay, but you have to give them a space in order to share what they want to share, to get to the point where they actually can become a full human. And again, all of us get angry, and all of us get emotional. All of us cry. All of us feel sad. And we just have to have a way to meet people where they are. And that's, I think, one of the reasons I wanted to write the book. It's not so much that I want to be like, oh, normalize, some people that are both on the masculine, manly man guy, like, I just want to normalize men crying, blah, blah, blah. It's like, dude, it's like such a myopic, short-sighted view, and not like, it's nuanced. The world is nuanced. It's not black and white. It's not toxic masculinity. It's not feminine. Like, come on, really? Yeah. Are we that dumb that we can't have nuance in the world? Yeah. And I think that's a conversation.
Yeah. What if we could all just be human and experience human experiences, regardless of genderized, concepts? And that sense of meeting people where they are is so important, because every single human grieves differently. Yeah. Every man grieves differently from every other man. And so on. And there's a concept in grief literacy that is the idea of intuitive grief and instrumental grief. I don't know if you've heard of those concepts before. So intuitive grievers tend to be folks who are able to be in their feelings. That's how they grieve. They're tearful. They have that expression, and they sort of spend their energy on the emotional expression of the grief. Right? They don't do a whole lot of other things while they're in that space of heavy grief. Instrumental grievers kind of are on the other end of the spectrum, and they are task oriented. So it's not that they're not grieving, but their expression of grief isn't that emotional output. The expression of grief is activity based. So maybe they're starting a memorial garden, or they create a fundraiser or a foundation, or they write a book, or they do different kinds of tasks that give them a place to put their thoughts and feelings about their grief that suits them in a way that feels right for their expression. So men and women can be on either end of the spectrum as intuitive grievers or instrumental grievers. There's no right or wrong way to be as a human.
Yeah.
And that's why we see some people who are more easily tearful. Yeah. And some people who crying is not really how they express themselves.
Yeah, they express it in different ways. Yeah, that's actually really fascinating that you bring that up, because I've seen that in other people, other widowers or widows, or just general people that are grieving about certain things. They tend to like do stuff, and like stereotypically men tend to do stuff, women tend to emote, right? Generally, again, we have to talk about these things because it's important to realize where people are. But I mean, I think for me, I'm more of a doer anyway. I have an engineering background, so I like to solve problems. So for me, in order to process it all, I had to do something. I had to like physically put it on the page. I had to churn it in my head. I had, I can talk about it now pretty openly. I could talk about it forever. I don't get as emotional. Early on, I'd get very emotional, cry, just get overwhelmed with just the fear, like the sorrow just like wells up, like I say in the book, the sort of like failure lump just like, overtakes you. Yeah. But as time goes on and you process it, I'm talking about the book a lot. I was at a book launch and signing, talking about Jane and the challenges. And, there's people in the audience that are, tearing up and very emotional. And I'm emotional, but my emotions, now that I've processed it and I've integrated it and I've sat with it and I've like worked through it and worked around it in my own way, it's just beautiful. Like I just and a lot of it has to do with, going to therapy, writing and expressing it in my own way. And I don't think there's any right, to your point, there's really no right way to express what you're feeling. You just have to meet people where they are. And I think I wish we could normalize that more, I think it's one of the reasons our society is just so splintered and dystopian at some point. Like there's a lot of, even among men and boys, you see the statistics and it's like appalling. All the suicide and disconnection. And you're just like, what the heck, man? And it's primarily this fighting in these boxes. Like, you're a man, you go in this box, you're toxic, you're a man, you've got to be toxic masculinity. You're like, how can that be? Can you call? You don't even know me.
Well, and I mean, my life's work is really about trying to meet people where they're at and helping them meet themselves where they're at, and figure out if what they need and how they can adapt. I mean, as humans, we are all going to experience grief and trauma of different types over the course of a lifetime.
That's true.
And so part of our work as humans is figuring out, how do we carry these stories of loss and pain and challenge? And so it sounds to me like some of the ways that you've been healing have been to, be in therapy where you're talking about your story and you're thinking about your feelings and your experiences, and you're kind of working it through and making some kind of sense out of something that doesn't make much sense. Putting it on the page is another way of doing that, with the goal maybe of helping other people connect with the possibility of accepting what doesn't make a lot of sense. and
Yeah.
having an example of, you know, a story that lets them know they're not alone, right? You know, in this experience. And so
100%.
it's those kind of things, it sounds like, that have helped you be able to carry this story so that you can tell it without being in the raw grief that you were once in.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the thing that's interesting is that the way it was put to me, this was my therapist, Scott, said this. It's like, we have to make the narrative make sense to us. So if the narrative doesn't make sense, you are going to have a lot of distraught and sorrow and grief. You're still going to feel those things, but the reason you're feeling so anxious and fearful and the world feels like it, just because the narrative doesn't fit. And your process, however you get there, needs to make the narrative fit. You have to have a narrative that makes sense to you, and before you can put it in so the way he put it was, before you can put it in the past, quote unquote, the narrative has to make sense. And until the narrative makes sense, you're going to ruminate, and you're going to always be fearful of this thing that happens that you couldn't make sense of. And and he literally told me this like this week, and I've been working with him for 6 years, ever since she died. Right. And so I really think that like made the most sense to me. One of the reasons writing is so important to me was because it helped me sort the narrative out. And I think once we do that, through where we get there, and then some people don't want to sort the narrative out. So they do silly things like I did, drink too much, smoke too much pot, the stuff that you're not supposed to do, which I don't do anymore because I don't need to. I worked through it, but you just, it's gotta, the narrative has to make sense, or you can't work through it.
Yeah. And I think, what you're talking about in terms of ways that you coped for a while is actually just human, right? I mean, when we're in pain, we do the things to try and ease the pain, lift us out of it. And sometimes those work temporarily, and then they sometimes cause us more problems.
Oh, yeah.
And then we still have to face whatever it is we're trying to escape or avoid. There's and they talk about kind of 4 tasks of mourning. And the first one is to accept the reality of what's happened. And that's sometimes what's so painful, is that, how can this be? How can this be my story? Right. And then as you accept the reality, then it's sort of feeling the feelings, and feeling difficult feelings makes us want to escape. Right. And then the third task is to find a way to still feel connected to the person who's deceased, right? So however it is that you honor their legacy, or feel connected to them. And then the fourth task is finding meaning and purpose. What is your meaning and purpose now? Because the day the person died, if not before the person died, everything changed, and your meaning and purpose was lost in the shuffle, because where you were headed, where you thought you were headed, isn't where you actually are going. And now you need new meaning and purpose. And I think, what you're talking about is like processing the story, figuring out a narrative that makes sense, involves all 4 of those tasks, right? And making your way to, where am I now? And where's my life headed? How do I make sense of not only what's happened to me, but what's next for me?
Yeah, no, it's actually a really interesting way you put it. I mean, I think I've read about this before, right? It's a lot of people get kind of caught between, 1 and 2, or never get to like connected to the person that's died.
Yeah, we can get caught in the not wanting to accept that it's real, or avoiding the feelings.
Yeah,
right.
Totally. And I think what's interesting is, to your point, I think the writing of the book kind of went through all 4 of those. I think now, I am connected to her forever, obviously. Our stories on in tangible form that anyone can read and really understand who she was, and feel, hopefully they know a little bit about her and understand the shared, like I had to bear witness to this.
Yeah.
And my job as a storyteller and also making sense of the narrative is to sort through it and actually bear witness to it as accurately as I can, and which I think I've done pretty well. And then when it comes to meaning and purpose after that, well, Jane and I had talked about like, well, what happens if she dies, right? Mm-hmm. Which no one ever wants to talk about, of course.
No.
But the thing that I think was the other gift that she gave me, which I hope I hope I could do this when I'm when I'm there, at the end, right? She was more worried about me than her. She really wanted me to find happiness and love again and live a fulfilling life. Thankfully I do have a wonderful fiance now. She's just the salt of the earth and just a beautiful person. She's helped me a lot with finding love again, understanding the meaning of the world, also honoring Jane and what she meant to me. And that's really beautiful. And I think also not only finding love again and the meaning and purpose behind that, but I think also what I want to dedicate some of my life to is, building better men. And I think building better men starts with, well, you know what? This is my experience with sickness and health till death do you part. If you're going to have a commitment, you might want to think about it a little bit. But then also what I think is something that I think men need to own, honestly. I don't think anyone can own this for us. I don't think anyone can change our narrative. I don't think anyone can, we've let people label us as being toxic masculinity and all the labels. Like, no, we don't own that. We own who we are. And I think people just have to own that, and they got to stand up and they got to say, nope, this is what a man is. This is how we need to deal with this. And we have real problems. Men and boys have real problems. Those men and boy problems translate into girl and women problems. Majority of violent crime, the majority of wars are men. I mean, what do you think's going on? Like, don't just say change. You got to be part of the process, right? So I think that's now the meaning and purpose of my life to a certain degree. I mean, I want to live a good life. I want to make Jane proud. Like, that's obviously I want my fiance Minerva and her daughter to, hey, okay, this is what a man in the role of being a male provider, caregiver, person, so it is.
Yeah,
that's why I'm talking about it. Well, I'll take the arrows, bullets, or whatever, but I have lived this experience. I bore witness to a beautiful woman who died too young.
Yeah.
Now I need to share that, and I need to help other men through the difficult journey that lies ahead.
Yeah. And part of how you do that is by finding your way first and then shining a light on that path. Right. And the book, writing a book helps do that. It helps show people a little bit of the inside. You talk about it bearing witness to Jane's experience, but it also is bearing witness to your own. And it's shining light on your feelings, your thoughts, your experiences throughout that process, which actually gives other men permission to feel those things and to, express them and figure this out. And by writing about it, by talking about it, by being in the world this way, there's an opportunity to sort of shine a light on the path and to walk the path yourself, right? Yeah. And when we do that, we encourage others, and it really only takes one person at a time with the courage to show up in their feelings and to show up for what's right for humans, right?
Yeah, it's very well said. Yeah, that's actually, people throw the courage word around a lot. Like, you're courageous, and I'm not one of those people. I have a hard time sometimes taking compliments, like standard kind of things. Some of us have. And I've just heard it so many times that people are literally like, I had a friend just say, just take the compliment, damn it. Right?
Yes.
Like, but then, if you feel, I feel uncomfortable with that. But this is the thing that then I realized. I said, well, okay, so people find courage in what I've done. At some point it was in my own mind. I don't think it's that courageous, but hey, if others, I can't, again, the lived experience, again, meeting people where they are. Okay. So I need to embrace this, and I just need to, because part of it's not about me. It's about their perception about this experience and their perception of me. They labeled it that. I didn't label it that, but I have to accept that. I have to be like, okay, you feel that way. I appreciate that. Thank you. This is how I feel about it. This is how I need to move through it. But there's been more than one person that should constantly say that. I'm like, how I was committed. Jane was courageous.
Yeah. But you know what? The thing about courage to me is that none of us feels like we have courage when we're in the act of performing courageous things, because to me, the idea of courage is that we feel fear and we move through it purposely because what's on the other side of that fear is worth it to us. And so you felt fear and pain going through losing Jane, and you felt fear and pain in the aftermath of losing her, and you still showed up to tell your story in a way and to move it into the world in a way that shows others what's possible. And you did that despite feeling pain and fear. And that's kind of where I land with courage. It's not about feeling brave. It's actually the opposite. It's not feeling brave and doing it anyway.
Yeah. Again, I'm learning, I'm growing.
Yeah, as we do,
we got to figure it out,
Yeah. And as long as you have breath, that'll be your job.
Right? Yeah. And again, I'm not going to get it perfect. I'm not perfect by any means. You read the book, you'll know. I'm just trying to figure it out just like everyone else. I think the thing that's powerful about having gone through this, writing about it, synthesizing it, integrating it, like really being comfortable with the narrative. Well, again, it was brilliant. Scott brilliantly put it. My therapist, he's like, the narrative needs to make sense to you. And until it does, you're going to be ruminating and feel horrible. And like, you just need to sort the narrative out. And I'm like, yeah, that's totally true. This helped me sort the narrative out. This helped me figure out those 4 things. Yeah. Right. I have now a better human for it, for sure. Of course, I wish I never had to go through it and lose Jamie. She died. I don't want to. No one. I'd give it all away. I'd give everything away to have her back. Obviously, but that's not realistic. I have to accept reality. Like as you said, like look, it's not coming back.
Yeah. But what you're kind of talking about is post-traumatic growth.
Exactly. 100%.
When you go through a difficult, stressful, traumatic experience, however you define that, we all have a post-traumatic stress response, right? Mm-hmm. And so there would have been elements of this experience that were probably traumatic to you at different times in different ways. And so you're having a natural response in your nervous system. Oh, yeah. And we can stay stuck there, and then we call that a disorder or an injury, post-traumatic stress injury or post-traumatic stress disorder. Or we can find our way through that the way that you have, and we can see growth. And even though we would have never chose to grow this way, now that we're here, we can grow anyway. And that feels like very much what you've been doing.
Yeah. That's actually a really good way to put it. I've always been trying to figure out the best words. I like post-traumatic growth.
Yeah.
I don't like, the other thing is like, I don't want to be the grief guy, right? Like, I really truly want people to understand that if you have a better than average attitude, which people that know me know that I'm a bit curmudgeon-y, that you can get through pretty much anything with the right support network. And again, like I was committed, like I took that really seriously. The other thing is I knew that if that had happened to me, she would have been the same way. I mean, she literally would have been like there till the end. And same with my fiance now, and like the friends I have. It's like this connection to the humans around us. It really gives us that, okay, I can handle hard stuff. And that's important.
Yeah.
And again, I think we miss that. We really do. And I just hope that everyone that reads the book will feel a little bit of that.
Yeah. And I think, that's why your story is such a good fit with what we do, because at Grief Stories, it's right in our title. We believe that sharing our stories helps us first because it's cathartic.
Yeah.
And then sharing our stories helps others know they're not alone, and it helps them find some ideas about what might help them, which is exactly, what your story is doing, both in your book and also as a podcast guest today.
Yeah, no, yeah, it's been wonderful talking to you about it. It's yeah, and every time I talk about it, one, it gets a little less scary, and two, again, I'm sorting the narrative out. Like I now, like, the whole courage thing is the best example. My narrative did not have courage in it.
Right.
But it's like any good idea, right? Any good thing gets pressure tested, you mix and match it. I mean, this is the reason why I think it's powerful to talk about this thing. In the world of ideas, in the marketplace of ideas, in the town square, if you cannot talk about your disagreements and with a genuine sense of compassion and learning and understanding, then that to me is intellectually dishonest, right? And that's why I just love that I've sorted out the narrative on this, but then the narrative is growing and changing because of the input, right? So
it's an evolution. We're all in evolution.
Yeah.
And our evolution is sometimes turned by challenges and sometimes turned by triumphs. Yeah. And often it's turning on less than a challenge or a triumph.
Oh, yeah. It's so true. Gosh, so true. It's challenge and triumph.
Right. And then the in-between times, right?
Yeah.
So, well, thank you so much for being a guest on the Grief Stories podcast today. It's been a real pleasure to help you share your story in this way too.
Really appreciate it. It's always great to talk about it and continue to refine the narrative, so to speak.
Right.
Refine the narrative.
I think it's a lifelong process. Refining the narrative.
I agree.
You're going to carry Jane's story throughout the rest of your life. And once in a while it'll shift here and there again, right?
Yeah.
It'll keep shifting. And I think that's the beauty of stories and the beauty of working our narratives throughout life. So.
Yeah, I agree. Totally.
All right. Well, thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Grief Stories podcast. I'm your host, Maureen Pollard. Please remember that grief is universal, but every person's experience of grief is unique. While our interviews are intended to help listeners feel validation and reassurance, we realize that these stories may be different from your own. Please visit our website, griefstories.org, for more stories of hope and healing.